My name is Jesse McCrosky. I am the Innovation Manager at HeroX, the world's leader in crowdsourcing. And today we are speaking with Jesse McCrosky, Senior Data Scientist at Mozilla. Jesse, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm super excited to speak to you.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely. So today we are diving into a super important topic, super relevant, and it's in the world of harmful content. Specifically, its effects and how we can go about stopping it. So as a starting point, Jesse, I would love you to tell me a little bit, or tell us a little bit about yourself. On your blog, you call yourself a Canadian that is now living in Helsinki, Finland. I'm super interested to hear about that story and why you chose Finland as the place to live and work. So let's start there.
It's funny, anytime I meet a new Finnish person that asks me why I came to Helsinki, they assume that I either have a Finnish job or a Finnish wife. And the answer is neither. I came here just because I wanted to. So yes, I grew up in Canada, lived in many different parts of the country, and eventually found my way to the San Francisco Bay Area in California in the US. Lived there for about 5 years. Never was quite clear that was where I wanted to end up. And at the point that I met my wife, and then especially when my daughter was born, I started to have more of a sense that it wasn't the right place for our family. So we were looking for somewhere that fits our values and has quality of life in the ways that are important to us. And I have a kind of complex family connection to Helsinki. My wife's sister's wife is Finnish, and so they ended up settling in Helsinki. And actually, my wife had lived in Helsinki for 2 years before we met, though she's actually from Spain. So it was a place that she had good experiences with, and we decided to give it a try. When we decided to move here, I'd been in Helsinki all of 4 days of my life, I think, but we took the leap, and we've been really happy here. It's been quite excellent. Quite fortuitously, perhaps, the move to Helsinki was also what prompted my transition from Google to Mozilla. I'd been a data scientist with Google for about 4 years, I think. But was not able to stay with my team in Helsinki. The office here is very small and doesn't do the kind of work that I was offering. So I needed a new job, and I had a former Google colleague who ended up being working with Mozilla in a remote capacity. And since I knew that was an option, I spoke to him, ended up speaking to some people at Mozilla, and it ended up working out. So I now work from home here in Helsinki, which I just love.
Awesome. Well, it's great to hear a little bit about that adventure that brought you to Helsinki. And I mean, I totally get it. Like sometimes those big bets, those big leaps into kind of the unknown is just, they pay off the most. And it sounds like you're super happy where you landed there in Helsinki. So, I mean, I could probably spend the entire time just talking about that adventure alone because it sounds like full of many stories.
But what we're here for, though, I suppose.
I suppose, but maybe another time. So let's talk about then the reason that we are here. So I poked around on your blog a bit, and in one of your articles, and I think in prior conversations, you've mentioned that harmful content or harmful online content is a huge problem, and I want to know, how pervasive is that problem, and what specific forms does it take, and you know, who is spreading this harmful content?
Yeah, it's a really difficult question. I think the thing to remember about harmful content is that it is contextual. So a particular piece of content can't just be judged, this is harmful, this is fine. It depends on the purpose for which it's being disseminated. It depends on the audience that's experiencing it. It's because of this, it's really quite difficult to measure the pervasiveness of the problem. One statistic I've seen around is that YouTube says that some fraction of 1% of their US views are what they call borderline content. So I talk about how this can't really be clearly defined, but of course these content platforms do have their own definitions. I mean, Facebook or YouTube has the terms of service, and they define there quite clearly what content is or is not acceptable on the site. But then they go further, and for example, YouTube has this concept of borderline content, which they don't really provide a clear definition of, but I'm sure they have one. And this is something where it's not, you know, clearly harmful to everybody, but might, under some circumstances or contexts, be harmful. I think that it's an old problem. I mean, there's been hate speech, there's been manipulation, there's been, you know, false news, whatever, as long as there's been language, I think. What's new, I think, is the tools we have to engage it at scale. The fact that we can reach such large audiences, that we can target our content so carefully to the individuals that are receiving it. I think this is really what's new and what the technology is enabling. In terms of who's spreading it, I saw a talk recently by a US researcher, Kate Starbird, on the Russian manipulation of the US election on Twitter. And she did some really great work showing how these kind of content farms or whatever were manipulating both the left and the right politically in the US, and how you could basically plot out the kind of space of the Twitter conversation. And on the left, you have a lobe of, kind of the more leftist, politically leaning folks. And on the right, you have the Trump supporters and everything like that. And you can see that the accounts belonging to these Russian hackers tend to be kind of on the extreme fringes of those circles. So you can just see how they're kind of trying to push the conversation further and further apart. And then the really critical piece is you notice that the Russian trolls on the right are telling people, everybody get out and vote for Trump. And the trolls on the left are saying, the whole system is rigged against us. Don't even bother voting. You've got to stick it to the man, whatever else. And it's just so clear what the intent and the scale and the amount of thought and planning and strategy that went into this. So, and this is just one example. And I don't think anybody really knows the true scale of how many campaigns like this are happening. I saw there was a new article about how Cambridge Analytica had activities much more broadly than anybody suspected previously, and was involved in whether you call it manipulation or marketing for a lot of different elections and political events around the world. But it is pervasive, even if we can't put specific numbers on it.
I think the thing that stands out the most to me from that, it sounds like, so these platforms that are spreading these harmful content, am I correct in saying that they're fully aware of what they're doing? They know that they're spreading this harmful content. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah, absolutely. And whether or not it's their fault, in a sense, is a difficult question. And whether or not it's their responsibility is another one. I mean, in Europe, we have the e-commerce directive, and in the US, there's the Communications Decency Act, Section 230 or whatever it is, that basically allows these platforms to exist. The idea is that if you're just a platform that's allowing other people to publish information, you don't have to be responsible or liable for all the content that's published there. And that really is a prerequisite for the internet as we know it to exist. If Facebook had to be legally responsible for everything that was posted on it, they just couldn't exist in their current form, because there's no way they can monitor and review the amount of content that they're going through. So these laws are not inherently bad things. I mean, that's debatable, but it's there is a good reason why this sort of legislation was developed. The problem is that it kind of goes too far, and there's just in the sense that they have no responsibility whatsoever. There's now kind of a backlash, and especially in Europe, I think that the government is getting increasingly concerned about these sorts of problems, which is a very good thing. And I think that the kind of nuclear option is to revoke or radically revise these sorts of legislations and make these platforms responsible for their content. And maybe that's going too far, because I think that there's a lot of good done by having these platforms where anybody can post and share content and discover these sorts of things. But I think these companies need to take greater responsibility. So yes, I think they absolutely do know that this is a problem. I know that the Mozilla Foundation's advocacy group is having a lot of good conversations with YouTube. You can see their YouTube Regrets campaign if you search online. And they're to some degree working with us on this. Whether they feel they're doing anything wrong or not, I'm not sure. And I think that this comes to, one of the biggest burning questions, I feel, which is this a problem because these content recommendation engines are amplifying bad content and kind of making things worse? Or is this problem just an expression that there's a lot of terrible people? It's kind of, is it just a social problem, or is it a social and a technological problem? And my bet is on the latter. I have a bit of a theory around how these sorts of engines might end up amplifying this sort of bad content. And the complicated bit is that if this is the case, then it ties very closely in with the business models of these companies like YouTube and Facebook, and it creates a very powerful conflict of interest to really solve the problem. It may be the case that the solutions they could take technically would also cost them money, basically.
Right.
And that's makes it more complicated for them to make the right choices, and also makes it much more difficult for researchers to be able to access the sorts of data they need to understand the problem.
Right. So it's not a simple thing, and I think what you're really saying is that it's not as simple as, you know, right, wrong. Now we're going into, you know, we're talking about actual if steps are taken, if it's going to affect bottom lines. And, you know, at the end of the day, these businesses are businesses, and their mandate is to, you know, increase shareholder value, increase profits, and it almost sounds like it's spiraled to a spot where now it's so complex and so messy that, I mean, is there a point of return? Do you believe that there is a point of return to get this to a place where, you know, it's not, you know, I don't want to use the word bad, but it's not bad. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I think that there is a path forward. I think a big part of the problem now is kind of the information asymmetry. And these companies hold all the data. They know everything about everyone. They know exactly how the problem is happening. They know to what degree, or could know to what degree, their policies and their algorithms are making the problems worse. And yet they're not the ones that are really incentivized to solve the problem. I think, you know, given what I've seen so far, I think probably the answers are in government regulation that would require these companies to open up and provide the data that's needed to really evaluate if there is this conflict of interest, and if necessary, kind of require remedies to improve the situation. It's funny, I mean, so Mozilla operates all around the world, and, you know, I was formerly a North American, now a European, so I kind of have the dual perspective. And I think the North American kind of policy perspective is that we want to find free market solutions, and we want to, you know, find ways to incentivize these kind of companies to do the right thing of their own accord in some sense. Whereas the more European approach is that, you know, some things just aren't going to work unless we make some laws to fix them. And I think I'm kind of coming around to the latter perspective, but I'm open to being convinced either way, I would say.
Right. So you're right now kind of leaning toward the only way this is going to be fixed is if we have a major uphaul or overhaul of actual legislation that is mandated for these companies to actually follow. Right. Who would be?
Yeah.
And that would be monitored then by the government. The government is going to be the one who kind of, you see them as being that, you know, that stakeholder who oversees all of this.
So, I mean, yes, or some body that is created. But I want to clarify that I don't want the government deciding what content is good and what content is bad. And I don't want them being some kind of police force or something like that. I think here in Finland, we trust our government very much, and people have very, you know, positive sentiments that way. But if we're creating solutions, they need to be international in scope. And I think that there are countries in the world where you do not want your government deciding what content is okay to post and what's not. So I think it's more about, it's not about the government fixing the problem. It's about the government creating structures which incentivize the businesses to fix the problem. So I think a lot of it is just greater transparency. One thing I'm working on at Mozilla that I'm very excited about is ways of making our data science practices more public and more transparent. And the idea is that if people are giving us their data, they have the right to know what we're doing with it. And I think that this you know, simple concept can apply much more broadly. And I think that these companies need to be more transparent about how data is being used, what's being done with it. And that's probably the first step to solving these problems. Right.
And that sounds super interesting. So let me ask this question. When it comes to like potential solutions that you're like maybe working on now, like with Mozilla, who does the responsibility actually fall onto? Does it fall onto the platforms, or does it fall onto the individuals using the platforms and then, like, you know, tapping into that into, you know, that knowledge of what we're doing with the data? Like who do you see that falling onto?
I think the responsibility is with the platforms, and this is a very philosophical question in a sense. And, you know, I tend to think that if I'm making a decision, if I have some unhealthy habit I want to change, say I was smoking and I wanted to quit smoking or something, I can say that's my responsibility. I'm going to make that choice. But when you look at this with the eye of a data scientist, the statistician, and you look at kind of aggregate populations, you kind of, this fundamental truth reveals itself, which is a little bit sad, but very true, which is that people are just incredibly easy to manipulate.
Yeah.
And there's a couple of people I like to follow. So Tristan Harris is another former Google employee that tried to create some change from within, which wasn't so successful. So he left and started this foundation, the Center for Humane Technology, I think it's called. And then he was in an interview with UL Nelson Harris, I think is the name, the author of 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. And they talk about this in a lot of detail, so I just don't want to steal their thunder. But people are easy to manipulate, and if you don't accept that, then you put too much responsibility onto people. If we said that, you know, people make their own choices, they choose what they want to click on, they choose what they want to consume, then it's very easy for the companies to say we're just giving people what they want. But the fact is that it's not that simple. And the easiest way to illustrate this for me, when I was at Google, we were running experiments on users in search, and this is all public, nothing secret here.
Yeah.
And you know, you some experiments. So for some users, some link is blue instead of red or whatever. That's just a hypothetical example. And you see that when you do this experiment, the users that get the blue link are, you know, 5% more of them will click on the link or something like that. And you think like, are these users making a conscious choice? Like, oh, that link is blue, I want to click on it now. No, it's that they've been manipulated in some sense. And you could argue over the semantics over whether that's really manipulation or persuasion or something else. But the fact is that what these platforms are doing affects people's behavior in a very profound way. And that I think that people can be manipulated in this way to take actions that are in some way against their own self-interest. So I think it's the same as, I mean, there's a discussion around climate change right now, how a lot of the big oil companies are saying, oh, you need to stop watching Netflix because it uses too much, you know, carbon to, you know, run the servers or something like that. And it's, you know, it's maybe that's true that if everybody stopped watching Netflix, it makes a difference. I have no idea, to be honest. But it takes away the reality that you can't just put that responsibility on people. You need the larger institutions that kind of shape behavior, like our governments and the large corporations, to take responsibility.
Right. So there needs to be more systems of setting people up for success. So we do make more, I suppose, responsible decisions. I do agree with you. We're very easily manipulated. And I think a big part of it as well is that we don't even realize how we are being manipulated. And I think in today's world, I mean, I'm a millennial. I mean, that's how we consume content. Everything's online. And I mean, I'm not too versed in the issue that happened, I think, a few years ago, but there was a whole thing about the type of content that you were seeing on Facebook. It was through the Cambridge like gate, and it's, you know, I didn't even know that was happening. I mean, I'm not in America, so I don't think it affected me as badly, but there's that and that's why I think that that's such an important point, right? Putting the responsibilities onto the platforms, because we most of the time we don't know, and you know, in the world where we are consuming content all the time, it's a lot. And we do consume a lot of content, very much so. So I mean, right now, okay, so and that's not going to slow down. Do you agree? Like, we're going to continue to consume content, because that's just, I think, where the world is. So what's the immediate kind of, you know, band-aid, if I have, like, for the lack of a better term, but because these other types of solutions that you're talking about, they sound effective, but they sound also like a long way away from where they need to be. So, you know, what can we do right now to, you know, stop the spread of harmful content?
So honestly, I think that it's a big enough problem. All our solutions are kind of longer term in a sense. I think that there are things that, you know, people can do. I think that education is one of the biggest answers here. And I think that, you know, people are more vulnerable to this kind of content depending on how strong they've developed their analytical thinking kinds of skills and critical thinking. There was a study a while ago where there's a little kind of online game you can play where you're trying to manipulate people to get more followers on Facebook and Twitter and everything like that. It's kind of a contrived but fun little thing. And they did a academic study with this, and they found that playing that game actually acted as kind of a vaccine for false content. And that after playing the game, the people in the study were less likely to believe different false stories. So I think that, you know, education, recognizing that this is being done, recognizing this is a problem, is definitely important. I think there are things that individuals can do to protect themselves to some degree. And I mean, there's all the, kind of privacy protections and anti-tracking protections, but they're not really that effective, to be honest. I think this is something that happens at the social level, not at the individual level. And it's just like vaccines, for example. If I get the flu shot, the chances that it makes a difference to me personally is probably pretty small. Maybe it protects me from the flu, maybe it doesn't. But if an entire society gets the flu shot, then it makes a big difference somehow. And it's the same here, that if I, turn on a lot of anti-tracking features in my browser and that sort of thing, then maybe I get fewer targeted ads. But if I live in the US, I still have Trump as the president, kind of thing. It's like, it's not just manipulation of me that impacts me, but manipulation of society as a whole. I think some of the consequences of this are kind of social breakdown, in a sense, that we have more divisiveness, that if people, there's less of a sense of shared values, less sympathy for each other. And it doesn't matter if I protect myself from this content or not, that's still going to impact me in a very real way.
So education, and I suppose, and that's a great point. And I mean, that is shifting, I suppose, responsibility back onto the individual, because that is within our ability, right? To take charge, to educate ourselves, to become aware of what we're susceptible to by browsing, by scrolling, by all these things that like we do all day, every day.
Yeah, I'll push back a little bit on the idea that we're putting the responsibility on the individuals there. And yes, it's good if we take the time to educate ourselves, but the education of a society depends on the education system in that country, for example. And here in Finland, we have a very good education system and people are being educated about this sort of thing. I don't think it's that, there's some people that just are not going to watch this interview or, read an article about how to protect your privacy online or that kind of thing.
Right.
We can't push that on everybody.
Right. I acknowledge that is a very, very good point. So, but all those, solutions, those are still very, like you said, societal, behavioral type of shifts that can be implemented by a maybe higher, body. But in terms of like technical solutions, you mentioned that privacy settings, sometimes aren't very effective. Are there any technical solutions that can be activated right now?
Yeah, and I think there's right now a little bit of a kind of battle on the nature of the web somehow. So Mozilla Firefox, relatively recently added a lot of tracking protection features that basically prevent third-party sites from being able to recognize the same users, traveling throughout the web. Yeah. And Apple Safari also has some of these features, I think. And this, I'm speaking on my own behalf, not on behalf of Mozilla right now. I'm not sure that's the best way forward or not. I think that there's, I'm very concerned about the social harms being created by data science, but I'm also very optimistic about the potential benefits. And I think that just kind of getting rid of data is not necessarily the solution. I think ultimately data is a tool and it can be used for good or for evil or for profit or whatever else. So Google put out a response to this kind of tracking protection trend where they claim that if everybody starts, blocking trackers, then publishers are going to make only half as much money on their web advertising and it's going to destroy the whole internet ecosystem. And I think that study is probably wrong. A colleague of mine did an analysis where he broke down some of the issues with it. And I think there's some issues I would take with it as well. But it's a real question of like, do we want to have a kind of data rich environment on the web? And I think that the answer is not a clear yes or no. But with that said, for the time being, I think breaking down the ability of these advertisers or manipulators, whatever, to be able to collect this much data about people is, going to break down their business model to some degree. And so these kinds of tracking protection features and that kind of thing, can be somewhat effective.
Gotcha.
The other thing is this is only really talking about the targeted types of disinformation. If you're looking at less targeted types, then, tracking doesn't matter. It's the real problem is the amplification coming from these sites. And I think that, the solution to that maybe is just stop using Facebook and YouTube. And that's a tall order for a lot of people.
Yeah, that's a big ask. That's a big ask for a lot of people, myself included.
the kind of, and this is not necessarily easier, but I think the intermediate solution there is just be very conscious for each piece of content why you're choosing to consume it. So I challenge myself to use my phone as little as I can because I'm very concerned about the impacts of spending too much time on it. And I kind of have a game I play with myself where I try every time I pick up my phone or take it out, ask myself, why are you doing this? Like, what do you want to do with your phone right now? And if it's, I want to check what bus I need to take to get over there, or I want to, like, send my wife a message to see where she is or something like that, that's fine. But I think half the time it's kind of, I don't really know why, I just want to distract myself somehow. And I think that recognizing that allows you to break those patterns. And I think I would hypothesize that a lot of the more harmful sorts of content is not stuff that people are consciously seeking, but stuff that they're exposed to more in the background, whether it's scrolling through a Facebook feed or a suggested watch next on YouTube or whatever else. So being more conscious about why and how we're consuming content, I think, can be powerful. But that's a very difficult thing to do. Right.
And I think it ties nicely back to what we spoke about before, which was, it's this unawareness of you are being manipulated, and it's through these indirect ways. And I mean, that's a really cool game that you play with yourself. I think I'm going to start trying to do that too, because I mean, it's a habit now. I like playing a game when I'm in a public place or when on public transport, and I look around me and see how many people are like not crouched over on looking at their phones, but like having a conversation, engaged in conversation, or looking at something else. And it's a habit, right? Like, I don't know if it's because humans just don't like speaking to each other, but like you arrive somewhere and your immediate action, if you're not if you're unfamiliar or whatever the case may be, you just like whip out your phone and you just start looking at it, right? And I suppose
so this is like a little bit off from the main topic of the interview, but I just can't help but touch on so in the kind of space of data ethics and such, the working with harmful content and that sort of thing is an interest I've developed mostly through my work with Mozilla, because it's something they're very focused on. But my kind of first love, I think, in this space is more about the addictiveness of technology. And I think that there's a very deep reason why people get addicted to their phones so easily and why it's so hard to not pull them out. And I think that data scientists are largely at fault. I won't go into like a ton of detail here, but basically anytime you're trying to build some online service or product or something like that, you're going to be measuring how successful that product is, and you're going to measure it in some sort of growth metric, as it's called. So you might be measuring how many people are using your product every day, or you might measure how many hours of video they're watching or something like that. And basically what happens is every decision your company makes ends up being kind of oriented towards increasing that number, whatever that is. And the problem is that there are a lot of ways to make these things addictive, and there's a lot of psychological tricks they exploit. And even without really intending it, if you just kind of like keep adjusting a product, trying to make it better, trying to make it different in different ways, and you're always guiding it by this metric, you're kind of naturally going to end up making it addictive in some sense. And I think that this is a very serious threat. I think in data science, one of the biggest challenges we have is to understand the difference between what we want to measure and what we can measure or are measuring. So ultimately, maybe I want to measure, I have a new game for a phone or something like that, and I'm very altruistic. So what I want to measure is, are people having fun with my game? That's what I want to try to measure, but I'm not sure how to do that. That's hard to measure. So like, okay, I'll measure how many times per day they're playing the game. And I think, hey, if they're playing the game more often, it must mean that it's more fun. So that's okay. I'm measuring kind of the same thing that I want to, it works out. But it's not the same thing. You can convince people to play a game more often in ways that do not necessarily mean they're having more fun. And it's the same, you can convince people to watch more hours of YouTube in ways that do not mean they're getting more value out of it. You can convince people to spend more time on their smartphone, that's not improving their life. And it's a huge problem.
Right. So, well, and I think that's one entire, or maybe multiple conversations that we can have just on that topic alone. But thanks for that little segue. That sounds, I mean, I can see how it ties back and how it's related and how it, it's all I suppose, part of one huge kind of monster, but kind of to bring us back to the harmful content. So, you know, we're talking about the fact that, you know, the stuff is a lot of the time unconscious, and you don't realize that it's happening. And a lot of the stuff that has the most effect on you is not stuff that you're intentionally seeking out, but it's just stuff that you kind of see as you're, you know, scrolling, or, you know, trying to avoid eye contact with someone on the street and you're just looking at your phone. Why is it not possible to just filter that stuff out?
You mean technically like in a web browser or something like that?
Yeah, just, you know, filter that stuff out, all the stuff that's...
Yeah, I mean, it's not impossible. And I mean, there are extensions for browsers, or, you know, browsers dedicated to ad blocking, for example, that are going to remove that. One thing, you know, I would maybe push YouTube towards is, if they can't really solve this problem with harmful content, why don't they turn off the automatic watch next feature? You know, and I know why they won't, because they would lose, you know, millions or billions or whatever of dollars, because people would watch less YouTube. But I think, and that's something that, you know, probably you could write a browser extension to do. I think there are tools. The problem is, I think the people that need these tools the most are the ones that are least likely to use them or install them or whatever else too. So it's hard to really make a big impact with this sort of thing. But yeah, no, I think it's an interesting approach. Some of it is, you know, you're kind of playing against two needs. One is that the user wants to use the product or service somehow. They want to go onto YouTube, and you're trying to guide them to kind of only the good stuff somehow. But it's fairly difficult to decide exactly what's the good stuff and what's not. I mean, you can take like an extreme case and say, if you go to YouTube, you can do a search, and you can click on one search result and watch that video, and then you're shut off, and you have to kind of do a new search all over again or something like that.
Right.
Or you can say, okay, you can watch, you know, if there's a suggested, you know, related video, you can watch it and click on it if you want, but it's not going to play automatically. And, you know, there's all these kind of gray areas, basically, of exactly what content you want to protect the user from in some sense. So I'm not going to say there's not good solutions in that space, but I think it's very subtle.
Yeah, but there's solutions. And I think we've spoken about it multiple times today, was that, you know, there are things that can be done. The creative things that can be found and, you know, implemented and really used to not reverse, but address this issue that is, you know, increasingly a big issue, and for a lot of us, and it's something that we don't even realize is happening. So with that, I live in the world of crowdsourcing. HeroX is the world's leader in crowdsourcing. And, you know, something that I just want to ask, you know, from that actual, you know, space, which is, you know, because you have had experience with crowdsourcing, correct? You have been part of those, some of those projects. So if you had a crowd, you know, 1 million solvers or more, what would be the problem that you assign to them to solve? What do you want them to figure out?
Well, I hear you like tough problems, so I'll give you some.
You love them, bring them.
What I would say is, I mean, the types of solutions we were talking about just now are very individual level. It's how kind of a person can protect themselves, or, you know, maybe if you built it into a web browser, how users of that web browser can be protected somehow. But I'm really more interested in solving the problem at a much deeper level, and, you know, kind of not needing the Band-Aid somehow. So I think from my perspective, there's kind of two steps there, one of which is to understand the problem and to what degree these content recommendation engine companies are responsible for it. So to get that information. And then the other is to find good regulatory solutions to be able to get these companies to act in the public best interest.
Right. So
I think one thing, you know, I don't know for sure. So just stepping back just a moment. So YouTube or Facebook, a content recommendation engine, has to decide somehow what content to show you. They have, you know, millions, billions, whatever of different videos or, you know, posts that could show up in your feed. And there's different kinds of feedback they use to decide that. So some of that is what we call explicit feedback, which is where a user is, you know, giving a star rating to a video or something like that. And we know this user thinks this video is good. But the other thing they use is what we call implicit feedback, which is just like this user clicked on this. So we think that probably means the user thinks it's good, but we're not really sure. Maybe they clicked on it to show their friend this dorky video someone sent them or whatever else, you know.
Right.
And kind of my hypothesis is that the fact that we're optimizing too much for implicit feedback is the reason why we're amplifying this sort of bad content. But I don't know that for sure. And it's very difficult to know that for sure unless you're sitting in a data center in YouTube or Facebook or whatever else. So I think that one thing I would ask this crowd is, can you come up with some kind of natural experiment or some other kind of, data collection approach to be able to determine if optimizing content for this kind of implicit feedback is amplifying bad content or not? And I think that there's a lot of people that have approached that and tried to make arguments that it does, but I don't think anybody's really gotten to the point of having compelling evidence yet. And that's something that I'd like to see someone come up with some ideas for. The other thing, I mean, on just to not be all kind of, big picture and everything like that, you made the point that, yeah, you can have browser extensions that can, help nudge the user into safer ways and maybe turn off YouTube autoplay or maybe remind Facebook users after 5 minutes, maybe want to stop scrolling and do something else or whatever else. So, I'd be interested in seeing what kind of ideas there are for developing these kinds of nudge tools that can help users protect themselves. I think also just one thing a friend and I kicked around, friend and colleague, is the idea of just being able to give people some warning when they may be being exposed to false information. And it's very complex because what's false information can be very subjective and very political and very complex. Right. But there's also some part of the space where it's like pretty obvious. There's some story that's been debunked 1,000 times on the internet, but people still fall for it. So I think it could be kind of cool to have a tool which is going to just kind of watch all the content you're consuming in your web browser and see if any of that matches something that's just really clearly been debunked. And if so, flag that for the user to some degree. And I mean, Facebook and YouTube have started to do this to some extent, but I think that probably they have their own interests. And if we had a kind of, more publicly motivated version of this, maybe we could do something better. So coming up with a design for something like that. And then the last thing is pretty abstract as well, but to think about how could we evaluate whether or not a tech company is doing their best to control bad content? Like what kind of framework could we have to be able to say they're doing right? And I mean, I don't want to get super technical right now, but just briefly, if they have, do they have models which are trying to predict if any particular piece of content is good or bad or not? And what's the performance of those models and how many people do they have rating their content and that sort of thing? I think there's a lot of variables and a lot of complexity here, and coming up with kind of a clear framework to be able to say like, yeah, you're doing okay, or this needs to be improved, will be very valuable. Right.
Well, you promised complex, and those do sound like complex challenges, but you know what? It's a complex problem. And I truly believe that there is a solution there, that it might be involved and might take a lot of brain power, but I think that the upside is definitely worth it, especially since it is becoming more and more of a prevalent issue. But I hope to see that challenge on our platform someday. That would be incredible. So Jesse, we are nearing the end of our time together, and we've gotten so much incredible insights from you today. So I thank you for that. But before we really just wrap up, I wanted to extend the opportunity to you to provide any closing thoughts, any closing remarks, either based on today's conversation, or you mentioned maybe where your true passion or interest lies is in the addictiveness of technology. So please do share.
Yeah, I think just a reminder that if our viewers or readers take anything away from this, is to understand that people can be manipulated and that people are taking advantage of that at a very large scale. Mm-hmm. I think that the technology is not inherently evil or anything like that. And even most of the people that are using it in bad ways, I don't think that's really their intent. I think it's just not thinking carefully enough or being blinded by profit or whatever else. But I think that we need to be aware and protect ourselves and try to understand why we're making the decisions that we make, and also to recognize that this has serious social consequences and is, you know, I think to some extent responsible for the very divided state we find our societies in these days. And so I think just trying to be sympathetic and compassionate and to do our best to understand other people that we don't agree with is kind of one of the best ways we can fight back against what's being done to us through this technology. Right,
right, agreed. Very well said. And you know, I think you hit the nail right on the head there. And with that, I think that's so much amazing. And like I said, this is a super relevant topic, super important. And Jesse, I can't thank you enough for giving us the time to actually come and speak about this, because it is complex. I acknowledge that, but you really provided us with a very understandable way of kind of looking at it. So thank you again. I heard many topics here, or a few little tidbits of things that I'm sure we can expand on in the future. I hope I have you sometime soon to chat again with. So well, thanks again. Yeah.
I'm glad you found it interesting, and thanks for giving me the opportunity. I'm happy to share these kinds of thoughts. It was a pleasure.
Fantastic. Okay, JC, I hope to speak to you soon, and have a great day.
You too. Bye.